But most importantly, it's the currency. Because the aid comes in the form of foreign currency. It could be euros, it could be British pounds. But it has to be converted to Israeli currency, to shekels, in order to be used, because Palestinians don't have their own currency. Everything is done in shekels. And the foreign currency stays in the Israeli central bank, in the foreign reserves of the Israeli central bank. This graph shows the foreign currency reserves in the Israeli central bank. And you can see that as the Oslo process began, there is a spike in the amounts of foreign currency reserves. It's not just because of taking over the aid, but it's also because of the gift that the US gave to Israel, loan guarantees, in order to reward Israel for agreeing to negotiate. So this was, and when you have the situation that I've just described, economists call this situation export. Export. It's because you have Israeli companies that are providing services to international donors in order to deal with a situation created by Israel, and the foreign currency ends up in the Israeli economy. And this means that Israel is exporting the occupation. It's becoming one of Israel's most important exports, because the international community is willing to keep paying for that. Okay, I'm not going to stay on this chart. I think it's also a bit difficult to see it. It explains the various dilemmas that donors have to face, whether they want to, when they try to provide a project, and how they face different obstacles. Eventually, every project is kind of divided into three parts. Part that does get to the Palestinians and does create some of the intended result. Part that ends up in the Israeli economy and makes Israeli companies profit, and part that is just destroyed and wasted. The three different parts are presented here as if they are equal thirds, but they're not equal thirds. Of course, it's just for demonstrating it, because Palestinians don't have their own currency and they don't have a central bank, so it's very difficult to try to calculate. Now, the cost of the occupation is the second question that brought me to write this book, and I think I'm not going to stay on that question because I don't know how interested you really are in the intricacies of the Israeli economy. It's more something that should worry Israeli citizens. But I'll just gloss over it very fast. And if you do want to raise questions about that in the questions phase, I'll be more than happy to answer that, but it's really up to you what you want to know. So just going very fast, even though the occupation was profitable to Israel in the first 2 decades because of various ways of exploiting the Palestinian economy, Palestinian resistance and the massive growth of the colonist population, which receives massive subsidies from the government, ended up making the occupation a burden on the Israeli economy, a very heavy burden, in fact. Most of the costs are security, and the cost is growing very fast because the colonist population is growing very fast, while the Israeli budget cannot keep up with the increase in the cost of the occupation, which means that it is not a sustainable project. It becomes a heavier burden, and it also comes with a lot of social costs, which are harming the Israeli society, causing higher poverty levels, higher unemployment, and most importantly, inequality. Israel has become the most unequal developed economy in the world, with the exception of the United States. The United States is a different story. And most of the cost comes in the form of internal security. Most of the cost. You can see that it's a top bar. This is a breakdown of the cost. Again, I assume that it's a bit too small for you to see, but anyone who wants, I'll be more than happy to give you the presentation. I think that I see you're taking pictures, but I can give you the presentation itself if you want. So the internal security costs mean, of course, all of the security guards that are stationed within Israel, because of this culture of fear, because of the constant conflict, and also the prison system, in which about 11,000 Palestinian prisoners, political prisoners, are held at any given moment, more or less, and this is a very heavy cost as well. Okay, and the final third question, the third question about that made me write this book, is about the global importance of Palestine, and why people seem to be so moved by this particular story, and so active about it, both on the Palestinian solidarity side and on the support of Israel side. You see a lot of mobilization, and you can also see that there's that Jerusalem is the city with the second highest number of journalists in the world after Washington, D.C. So it's also very heavily covered in the international media. I assume that you're aware of that. If you turn on your television, you will see more stories about Israel-Palestine compared to any other region where you only have about 11 million people living. Well, except maybe your local news, of course. Why is that? Partially because Israel tried always to position itself in alliance with the West, because Israel perceives itself as a foreign entity in the Middle East. The current defense minister in Israel, Ehud Barak, once said that Israel is a villa in a jungle. In fact, I think that really demonstrates the kind of colonial thinking. So Israel doesn't seek to embed itself in the Middle East. It seeks to become to be part of Europe or part of the US in the Middle East. So when in 1956 Israel joined Britain and France in a colonial war against Egypt, trying to punish Egypt for nationalizing the Suez Canal and maybe trying to take over the canal again. And later, when colonial wars were not so popular anymore, Israel instead joined the Cold War by presenting itself as the forefront against the spread of communism. Since Egypt and Syria were receiving assistance from the Soviet Union, Israel claimed that it cannot possibly negotiate with the Fatah because the Fatah are socialists. At that time, Israel instead supported Hamas and promoted Hamas, the Hamas party, because they're Muslims, so they're not communists, so they're not dangerous. They are supposed to be the conservative alternative. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that strategy was no longer relevant, and that was one of the reasons why Israel had to start negotiating the Oslo negotiation, and why Israel was frantically looking for a new cause to align with the West, which they received in the form of the War on Terror. The attack the terror attacks of September 11 were said by Netanyahu at the time to be very good to Israel, very good for Israel, because now the whole world sees how important Israel is in fighting terrorism. Or in other words, what he didn't say, how important Israel is in fighting Islam. And Israel positioned itself at the forefront now of the war on terror, or the war against Islam. Also the war against immigration. Israel is, as I imagine you know, one of the world's biggest arms exporters in the world. It's one place after the UK, actually. But in addition to that, it's also the world's biggest exporter of homeland security products. Homeland security products are different than just normal weapons, because they're not intended at fighting wars and fighting armies. They're intended at controlling civilian populations. And homeland security products such as surveillance cameras, such as airport security measures, such as biometric information devices and monitoring equipment, databases on individuals, very extensive databases and computer programs that are designed to try to track suspicious activity through scanning databases, and also training security guards to spot suspicious individuals and detain them. All of that technology is sold by Israel, and many of these companies, well, almost all of these companies, have as their owners or their managers former military officers from the Israeli army who say, we are experts because we've actually tried this technology on human beings. We have a laboratory. This technology has already been tested. And I think that one of the reasons that we see so much support in the world, and especially right-wing parties, you see a lot of extreme right parties in Europe, in every country in Europe with the exception of Germany, that strongly support Israel, because it's not just because they want to keep a fresh supply of homeland security equipment, because they also want to have Israel as a legitimate example or a role model for using this on actual human beings.